With the emergency bailout equipment checked, the men busied themselves on another continuity test of the myriad circuits spread like a human neural system throughout the ship. All relays, servo systems, and instrument leads were in perfect condition, as expected, and the trio was settled comfortably in acceleration couches with minutes to spare. Logan contacted ground control a few seconds after the -3 minute signal, informing all and sundry that Gridley could fire when ready. McNamara sighed, thinking that if Logan's humor wasn't exactly original, it was surely tenacious. The ship was brought to dim half-life at -1 minute by Logan's agile fingers, and as the final countdown rasped in his headset, Mac felt his innards wrestle among themselves. Valier bellowed her enthusiasm suddenly, lifting her 8,000 odd tons from the ground almost instantly. Inside her, occupants grimaced helplessly as they watched various instruments guide tiny pointers across calibrated faces. Mac's throat mike threatened to crush his Adam's apple, weighing 5 times its usual few ounces. Of his senses, sound was the one that dominated him. An intolerable continuous explosion from the motors racked his mind like tidal waves of formic acid. He forced himself to overcome the numbness which his brain cast up to defend itself. Then, as quickly as it had begun, Valier fell deafeningly silent. That meant Mach 1 was past. It was an eternity before Stage 1 separated. The loss of the empty hulk was hardly felt as Valier streaked high over the Texas border. Ruiz, watching the radar scope, saw Lubbock slide into focus miles below. Next stop, Fort Worth, he thought. I used to drive that in 5 hours. The jagged line of the caprock told him they were well on their way to Fort Worth already. The altimeter showed slightly over 42 miles when Stage 2 detached itself. Logan, in constant contact with White Sands, was informed that they were tracking perfectly as Valier arrowed over central Texas towards rendezvous at the Donut. The exhausted lower stages were forgotten now. Only the second stage was of any concern anyway. The radar boys tracked it all the way down, ready to detonate it high in the air if its huge chutes wafted it near any inhabited community. The motors of Stage 3 blasted for a carefully calculated few seconds, then cut out automatically. With the destitution of his weight, Mac felt his spirits soar also. They were almost in orbit now, climbing at a slight angle with a velocity sufficient to carry them around the Earth forever, a streamlined, tiny satellite. After the first few moments of disorientation, rocket crews found that a weightless condition gave them ambiguously a buoyant feeling. Only the Donut crew had really adapted to this condition, living as they did without the effects of gravity for hours at a time every day. The temporary housing was rotated for comfort of the crews during rest periods, but while moving the plates and girders of the giant donut into place, they had no such luxuries. For these men, weightlessness became an integral part of their activities. But the rocket crews were subjected to this phenomenon only during the few hours needed to rendezvous, unload the cargo, and coast back after another initial period of acceleration. Hence, Mac felt a strange elation when he tapped his fingers on the arm of his couch and saw his arm float upward, due to reaction from the tap. Against all regulations, Logan unstrapped himself and motioned his comrades to do the same. This unorthodox seventh-inning stretch was prohibited because it left the pilot's armrest controls without an operator, hence could prove disastrous if, through some malfunction, the ship should veer off course. The autopilot functioned perfectly, however, and Logan trusted it to the point of insouciance. The 3 men lounged in midair, grinning foolishly as they swam about the tiny cabin. No more satisfying stretch was ever enjoyed. A few minutes of this was enough. Ruiz was the first to gingerly pull himself into his couch, and his companions followed. Not a word had passed between them, since they were at all times in contact with monitor stations spaced across the world below. The first time they had enjoyed this irregular horseplay on the second trip, Logan had made the mistake of saying, "Race you to the airlock," and was hard put to explain those words. Nor could Logan switch to intercom only, since a sudden radio silence would create anxiety below. Only their heavy breathing would indicate unusual activity to Earthside. They were nearing the intercept point, 1,000 miles above the Atlantic, when they realized their predicament. "I'm in a fix, Carl," said Ruiz, meaning that he had tentatively fixed a position of intercept. "Correct our elevation. We're 0.9 degrees high." "Right-o. Correction in 5 seconds from my mark." "Mark." For slight corrections in the flight path, small steering motors were utilized. These motors were located near the rear lip of Valier's conical cargo section on retractable booms. Extension of the motors with no resultant air friction gave a longer pivot arm and consequently better efficiency. Mac pressed the aux steer stud, and immediately 3 amber lights winked on in their respective instrument consoles. Carl Logan fired the 12 o'clock motor briefly, only it didn't fire. The change in momentum wouldn't be much in any case, but it was always perceptible by feel and by instrument. There was no change. Logan tried the firing circuit again and again. Still Valier streaked along, now miles above the intended point of intercept. By this time the embryo space station was quite near, sailing along in the scope beneath them. It slowly moved toward the top of the scope, passing Valier in its slightly higher relative velocity. "We've got troubles, Mac. Find 'em." Logan had finally lost the devil-may-care attitude, but that fact was small consolation to McNamara. "Keep your mitts off those firing studs, Carl," he growled, unstrapping himself quickly. The malfunction was definitely in the auxiliary motor setup, he thought. A common trouble? It wouldn't pay to find out. If the other motors fired, it would only throw them farther off, of course. If worst came to worst, they could roll Valier over and use the 6 o'clock auxiliary. There was a small arc through which the motors could turn on their mounts. But the trouble was unknown, and they might end up rifling or pinwheeling if they didn't let bad enough alone. During his mental troubleshooting, Mac was busily worming his bulk into a balloonish-looking suit identical to those worn by the Donuts construction crew. Ruiz gave him some aid, helping him thrust his arms past the spring-folded elbow joints. For some reason the legs gave less trouble. Within a few fumbling moments he was ready for work. He glanced at Logan through his visor, feeling a vicious pleasure over the beads of sweat on Logan's forehead. Time he sweated a little, thought the mechanic. A final check of his headset followed, after which Mac oozed into the Lilliputian airlock at the bottom, now rear wall of the cabin. He nodded to Ruiz, who secured the airlock, then adjusted his suit control to force a little pressure into his suit. Gradually the suit became livable. Then he cracked the other airlock valve and allowed pressure to leak out around him. His suit puffed out with soft popping noises, and Mac heard the last vestiges of air hiss out of the chamber. He found the hatchway too tight for comfort, and had a moment of fear when his tool pack caught in the orifice, wedging him neatly. He could hear Logan and Ruiz through his earphones, explaining their plight to ground control. They wanted to know why in blue blazes Valier hadn't contacted the Donut when it came within range, and Logan had no defense save preoccupation with his own plight. Belatedly, Ruiz made radio contact with the Donut, which was still well within range. All this time Mac busied himself with his inspection light, tracing the electrical leads to the small turbine-operated auxiliary motor fuel pumps. "Mac," Logan's voice startled him. "Can you brace yourself? I'm going to try to match velocities with the Donut. We won't take over 1G for a few seconds." "Wait a minute." He looked wildly about him. Valier hadn't been built with a view towards stowaways, and every cubic inch of space was crammed with something except for the passageways with its ladder leading up from the main motor section. Well, if it wasn't over a G, he could hang on to the ladder. Suit weighs another 50 pounds, though. My weight plus 50, he thought. "Give me a chance to get set," he said aloud. He hooked one bulbous leg over a ladder rung and braced the other against a lower rung, hugging the ladder with both arms. "Anytime you say, but kill it if you hear me holler. Then 5 seconds from my mark. Mark!" Mac tightened his grip and then sagged backward as the main motors fired. The vibrations shook him slightly but deeply as he fought to keep his hold. He felt his back creak and pop with the sudden surge of weight. Then the motors shut off, and Mac skidded several feet up the ladder. No matter how fast a man's reactions were, they couldn't be applied quickly enough to keep him from starting an involuntary leap after bracing against a suddenly removed gravity load. "All over, Mac. You okay?" "Guess so, but I feel like a ping-pong ball. How we sittin'?" "Just fine," Ruiz cut in. "Find anything?" "Not yet." Mac started his search anew. Everything seemed in perfect order up to the turbine pumps. Then he feared the trouble was near the little motors. That was tough, really tough. With the motors retracted, it was next to impossible to get to them past their hydraulically operated booms and actuators. Extended, he'd have to go outside. He cringed from the thought, although he knew that there was little to fear if he linked himself to the ship. He peered along the beam of light, searching for some telltale discoloration in wiring or a gleaming icy patch which would indicate a fuel leak. Might be